is Nikki Hannon, and I did Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. I find this very interesting because we all are faced with crises, as you're going to see in my presentation about Erik Erikson, and it's from these that we develop into who we are. So let's get down to it. So a little bit of background. Erik Erikson was a psychologist, and his studies were greatly influenced by Freud. However, unlike Freud, who studied id psychology, Erikson studied ego psychology. And this brings us to our essential question. And the essential question for this lesson is, how does the ego develop? This is a very important question to ask ourselves. And throughout this presentation, you're going to see a series of stages that occur that help us develop the ego. So there's three elements: ego identity, ego strength, and conflict. The most important element of this is conflict, in which Erikson stated that we all have these conflicts that we're faced with throughout our lives, and it's from these conflicts that we change our developmental paths. So in this chart, you can see that we start with trust versus mistrust, and we go all the way up to integrity versus despair. As the stages grow, they increase in complexity. So let us begin with stage 1, which is trust and mistrust, and this occurs during infancy. This occurs from the ages of 0 to 1.5 years, and this is during this time that hope is developed. Well, hope is developed and trust and mistrust is developed if the child grows up in a loving home and a caring home and happy voices, then they will become more trustful to those around them. However, if a baby grows up in a house where voices are brash and harsh and there's yelling occurring, then the baby will become more mistrustful later on. That brings us to stage 2, which is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this occurs between the ages of 18 months to 3 years. And this is where the virtue of will develops. It's also during this time that independence is learned. I do have a short clip for us to watch regarding autonomy versus shame. So this is from the show Rugrats, and this is during stage 2, and the goal of this was to get Chucky potty trained. So sit back and enjoy this short clip.
It can't be done, Dee Dee. It just can't be done.
Oh, now, Charles, don't get discouraged. Everybody gets potty trained sooner or later.
Not Chucky, not my son. He's going to be taking diapers to work with him in his briefcase.
Dee, it was an accident. Lots of kids haven't been potty trained at his age.
Really? Like who?
Well, like me, for instance.
You? You mean you weren't potty trained when you were 2?
2? Shucks, we almost didn't get him into the Boy Scouts.
Oh, Pop.
Why, I remember the time me and the missus took the boys cross country and
But Chucky, they can't do that to you. Well, they're doing it. They call it getting potty trained. It's the worstest thing that's happened to me since my mom put me on the bottle.
Now what, Dee?
Well, according to Lipschitz, we're supposed to wait right here until he does his business, then give him plenty of praise so that he gets the right idea. Well, I really gotta go.
Dee, he did it! He did it!
Did what, Stu?
Look, Dee, he got out of bed all on his own. He came in here, and he did it.
I'll say. Bravo, Chucky.
Way to go, Chucky. Little potty animal.
I hope you enjoyed that clip. that is how we reach stage 2, this autonomy versus shame and doubt. At the beginning of the clip, Chucky was very ashamed of himself because he couldn't go potty on his own. But when he had more praise, he was able to learn that independence of being able to go potty. Stage 3 is initiative versus guilt, and this occurs between the ages of 3 to 5. And this is where children frequently assert themselves. They tell you what they want to wear. They tell you what they want to eat. They tell you how they want their hair. And this is also where they're expanding their friends group. And this gives them the virtue of purpose. Stage 4 is competence versus inferiority, and this occurs from ages 5 to 12. And this is where children are learning to read and write. This is during the elementary age. And this is where they are really, really doing things on their own. And if they continue to get praised and continue to get influenced in the correct and positive ways, then they have a sense of competence. However, if they are not meeting society's standards or, say, the teacher standards, then they get this feeling of inferiority. It's actually during this time that teachers have a lot of influence over students and over children because they have this ability to praise them and positively reinforce them of their actions. Then we get to stage 5, which is identity versus role confusion, and this occurs between ages 12 to 18. And these are the teenage years. This is the secondary education years. This is where they begin to look towards the future. This is where they begin to decide what kind of adult do they want to be? What kind of career do they want to be? This is also where they identify themselves in their sexual roles in society. This is where the virtue of fidelity is developed. Stage 6 is intimacy versus isolation, and this occurs between ages 18 to 40. This is where people begin to have more close and more intimate relationships with each other. This is where people are finding their future spouses. This is where the marriage happens. And also, on the flip side of that, this is where people can become isolated and lonely and depressed because they are not seeking those relationships. This is where the virtue of love is developed. Stage 7 is generality versus stagnation, and this occurs between the ages of 40 to 65. It's at this time that people really begin settling down in their careers and their relationships, and they're looking more towards the future of retirement and where they would like to be at that time. And this is where they begin to really care for one another. This is where the love turns into the virtue of caring. We then get stage 8, which is ego integrity versus despair. This occurs from ages 65 and up. This is where the productivity is slowed down greatly. And this is where people begin to contemplate their accomplishments. And they get this virtue of wisdom. This is how we get our old and wise. Let us revisit our essential question of how does the ego develop? Through my understanding, the ego develops through a series of crises that occurs throughout our lives that change our stages of development. I really enjoyed that clip of the Rugrats with Chucky going to potty train because you can see the effects of negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement. And that is just a prime example of a conflict or a crisis that happens within the stages of our lives that develops the ego for what it is and what it can be and who you can be. And it's a continuous learning curve of this. And there's just so much that can happen within each of those stages because a lot of the stages have a large span of age ranges, and it's during that time that many crises can occur and many conflicts can occur that tweak the ego a little bit each time. Thank you for listening. These are my resources. I hope you enjoyed my presentation about Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Have a wonderful evening.